The Gospel of Matthew begins with these words, an account of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob. And Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Aram, and Aram the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Salmon, and Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David, and David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. I was informed by one member that last Sunday was not an R-rated story, but an X-rated story. If you think that, you haven't been to a movie lately or watched anything on television. I would call this perhaps a PG-13 story. Who is this woman anyway? It's difficult to know what name to use. Is she Bathsheba? Is she Eliam's daughter? Is she the wife of Uriah the Hittite? The answer is yes. That's who she is. All of these. But the defining narrative of the early part of her story, the first text, focuses on David. David sees her, takes her, uses her, married as she is to Uriah. And she gets pregnant. And David's attempts to cover up, they fail. The situation grows worse, even after David has Uriah placed in a situation in battle where Uriah dies. And David does that in order to cover up the adultery. And even after all of that, and even after she has given birth to the child born of this sordid event, the text after all of this, Uriah dead, married to David, given birth to a child, still refers to her as Uriah's wife, which says way more about David than it does her. For all of his power, for all of his conniving, for all of his planning, for all of his power, he can't change that. In the Samuel text that we heard, Uriah's wife, Eliam's daughter, Bathsheba, she's passive, she's property, she's owned, she's acted upon. He's the king. She has no choice. This is no affair. There is a huge power differential here. David is portrayed here, and rightly so, as an adulterer and as a murderer. But the witness of Scripture is clear about who she is. She is Uriah's wife, and she must not be mistaken for anybody else. All that David has done does not erase that. With all of his power, he cannot change that reality. And even in Matthew 1, just to remind us about what David did here, she's Uriah's wife. Even the best, even somebody like David. Do you remember that David was proclaimed as one after God's own heart, is capable of doing horrible things. David has no regard for the law, for custom, not to mention compassion. He fancies himself above all of this. He violates every moral value, every virtue, every taboo. Does that sound familiar? In 2025, in our nation? So, it's a good question, I think. Why does David do this? Well, he's king. He can do these kind of things. There's nobody to stop him. Maybe that's it. Or he's old. Or can he still win the heart of a beautiful woman? Perhaps it's a midlife crisis. Who knows? These things are never easy, never simple. They're always complicated. They're always complex. As we've seen in the first text, David does all of the acting, while Uriah's wife has no voice. We only hear 3 words from her. If you read on in the text, she says, "I am pregnant." It's all we hear. Kings may think that they can get away with these kinds of things, but there's an ominous word in verse 1 of chapter 12, which reads, "But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord." Uh-oh. He thought he was king, but there's somebody greater. You know, there are always consequences to our sin. We never, at the end of the day, get away with it. As one of our pastors, one of my pastors said, the mills of God's justice grind slowly, but they grind exceeding fine. Because God loved David, God would not let David get away with this. And so Nathan the prophet comes to David and speaks truth to power. David convicts himself. And in chapter 12, remember, our sin has consequences. It's just the way things work. If you and I run out into Roswell or Queens in front of a speeding car, guess what? We're going to get hurt. That's just the way things work. There are consequences to our bad choices. And in chapter 12, the child born of this twisted tale of adultery, manipulation, and abuse, this product of David's use of power that is an affront to all things upright and decent, this child dies because of David's sin, according to the text. Now, I'll be honest with you, I have some questions about that, but that's for another day. This horrible tale, thank God, is not the final word. Not the final word. I believe it was William Sloane Coffin who said, "There is more mercy in God than there is sin in us." Wow. There is more mercy in God than there is sin in us. How many times in this season of the year where we hear about the worst of sinners? Remember the Grinch who stole Christmas? What was his problem? His heart was 2 sizes too small, right? And what about Ebenezer Scrooge in Dickens' Christmas Carol, who's described in this manner, and I quote, "The cold within him froze, his old features nipped His pointed nose made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and he spoke out shrewdly with his grating voice. Or perhaps it's a hateful old aunt, or as we said in Kansas, an aunt. Perhaps it's a hostile church member. But the witness of this season is that redemption is possible. Transformation can happen. Somehow, some way in the mystery of God, good can come out of something that started out so badly. Not that what happened was ever good, but somehow some good can come some way by the grace of God. Remember, there's more mercy in God than there is sin in us. Eventually, David and Bathsheba have another son, one named Solomon. And in the First Kings text, we are in a very, very different situation. David now is the passive one. He's the submissive one, and Bathsheba takes the lead. Bathsheba is no longer acted upon. She is no longer owned. She has changed, and for the better, we might add. Adonijah, one of David's son, wants to be king, and as David is on his deathbed, Adonijah sets out to become king. Enter Nathan, once again, who warns Bathsheba what's going to happen and urges her to speak to David. She does, and let me assure you, this was not proper etiquette for her to do this. It could have led to her death, but she goes to David and tells him what Adonijah is up to, and Solomon, instead of Adonijah, becomes the king. Here's a woman, much different from the one we met in the Samuel text. She takes risks. She listens. She listens to wise advice. She isn't manipulated or used. She makes her own decisions. Someone who has been treated as property, as a non-person, as something simply to be used by the king, has become a full person, has become a part of God's plan. Even though she was an Israelite, she had married a foreigner and was considered a foreigner because she had married Uriah the Hittite. She was considered a Gentile. Somehow this woman who was a foreigner was included in God's plan for humankind. Who would have thought in this deeply patriarchal culture, a woman considered to be an outsider could play that role? Will wonders never cease? Do you think it could happen here? I believe it could. I believe it does. I've seen it happen. I have. This all started out as one huge mess, but then, isn't that the story of Scripture? Isn't that a consistent theme throughout Scripture? That we humans are endlessly creative in making big messes. Big messes that bring pain, suffering, and death. And in the midst of those messes, we find God at work in history, working out God's purposes. Even as you and I, even as humans plan, scheme, and are involved in raw, crude politics. Bathsheba, she didn't change overnight. It was a process. It took time. But the good news is that you and I have a patient God who's willing to work with us through our messes. Remember, there is more mercy in God than there is sin in us. The good news is that God comes to us through human history, through ordinary human beings. Tuesday night, Fran Morrison, Janice Bradner, Diane, and I represented you all at Lessons and Carols at St. John's. And there was a poem, there were several poems written by a woman, I don't know her, Lori Gauger. And she mentions the birth of Christ, and this line caught my eye and my imagination, that after the birth of Jesus, everything ordinary is tinged with the extraordinary. Wow. But for that to happen in my life and in your life, like Bathsheba, we've got to show up and pay attention. In Matthew, despite the unusual circumstances surrounding Jesus' birth, it is this Son of David, Jesus, whom God exalted as king, and not some Johnny-come-lately in the 21st century. This is the one whose birth we are preparing to celebrate. God didn't give up on David and Bathsheba. I'm grateful that God doesn't give up on you and me. Because like Bathsheba, we can grow toward becoming all God created us to be. Are you ready with Bathsheba to head in that direction?